My return from Vietnam had an adverse effect on me the rest of my life. When I got out of the service, I was 4 or 5 months in the hospital. I experienced close to 25% of my body burned, 2nd and 3rd degree burns. I was seriously wounded, and upon return out of the hospital, they gave me my back pay and gave me a new uniform, and I was out of the Army in a day and a half. Well, we had to take standby flights, so the plane, we flew into Oakland, California, and from there we flew into Dallas. There was a 5 or 6 hour overlay in Dallas. I got off the airplane. I wasn't quite 20 years old yet, and I had a chest full of medals, and I walked with a cane because I sustained shrapnel in my legs and in my back. And as I walked through the airport, 3 fellas came up and spit on me and called me a women and children killer, and I didn't know what to do. I was scared, and so I swung my cane at them. The airport police came, and there was a lot of screaming and yelling, and I got put into the airport jail. I was released, but I missed my flight home, so they gave me another flight and sent me to Chicago. And those days, airports weren't as nice as they are now, and Chicago was filled with a lot of criminals and pickpockets and prostitutes, and it was a place that was not a place you wanted to stay in overnight. And Chicago was getting a snowstorm, and I was caught in that airport for almost 2 days. So what occurred was that I became totally paranoid because I had no idea what was happening in this country, that people were spitting on me and screaming at me because I had a uniform on. It was not what I understood the country to be before I left to go to Vietnam. And I wound up sleeping in a corner for 20, 25 minutes. I would get out of that corner and go find another corner and sleep for 25 minutes and find another one, just as if I was back in the jungle again. And I didn't understand what life was like in the United States. And I had a paranoid phobia, I guess you could call it, about it. And I knew what to do in the jungle, but I just didn't know what to do in civilian life. And I just wanted to come home and see my mother.
There was a strong element of Irish immigration in Philadelphia in the 1700s, especially 1770s and the 1780s. Beginning in the early 1800s with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, groups of lower-end economic immigrants, guys who would be referred to as exiles perhaps from the Irish culture and the Irish economy dominated by the British. The group that collectively are referred to by one historian as a kind of mobile army of cheap labor for the American Industrial Revolution. A lot of these individuals and families settled into the areas around the rivers in Philadelphia. Around the Delaware River, these would be known as the river wards, and around the Schuylkill, the area that later became known as Swampoodle. The lower sections of the city that had been the nerve center of the early republic, one time the federal capital of the United States, was very expensive real estate comparatively to some other outlying areas closer to the rivers that were less desirable, considered to be less desirable by the establishment. So the reason why the Irish ended up in the areas along the rivers is because they were less valuable pieces of real estate, simply. Later on, of course, populations became an integral part of the Industrial Revolution, working in the factories that cranked out iron products like railroads. But originally, the reason why they went to these outlying areas is because they were cheaper, they were less valuable, they were swampy and not places where the elite wanted to live.
Swampoodle That was a very interesting neighborhood.
Swampoodle
was a
great neighborhood to grow up in.
neighborhood in North Philadelphia. The Germans were the first settlers in there, and then the Irish came in.
The Irish fled from political oppression and economic deprivation in their home country, increasingly in the middle of the 1800s, as the Great Hunger, as it's called in Ireland, or the famine elsewhere, would take out a substantial percentage of the population through death and through international migration. Philadelphia was one of the primary points of arrival in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s for Irish fleeing persecution and hardship in their home country.
Many Irish came to Philadelphia, and this holds true for other cities as well.
Where are you going to go? You're going to go to a place that is somewhat familiar to you. What is familiar to you? Another area, another neighborhood that has a bunch of Italians or Irish people living in it?
In addition to the Irish in Swampoodle, there were also Italians, and they shared many similarities, especially the longer they sort of lived in proximity to each other. They were very family-centered. They were very church-centered.
My grandparents came from Italy, went to Ellis Island, and from there they came to Philadelphia, where they started a business.
I lived in Swampoodle all my life. My grandparents moved there in 1920.
When my mother came over to Ireland in 1916, her brother lived on Hamburger Street, which was at 23rd and Lehigh.
A lot of the grandparents had that broke because so many of us had came from Ireland, our ancestors had came from Ireland. I didn't think I ever realized there were anybody but Irish people until I was about 12.
And like the Irish, many focused on public service, police services, fire services, teaching, and in addition to that, very centered on small businesses, which would have been up and down Lehigh Avenue, which at that point was a major shopping venue in the city of Philadelphia.
They instilled pride in us, hardworking people. My mother's family, they were hardworking. They also had a grocery store.
It was just totally understood that you were Catholic, you were Irish, and this is what your personality was, and you should adhere to it.
Everything revolved around work, family, kitchen, church, and all the neighbors looked out for each other back then.
Housing was affordable in that they were mainly row homes. They were what you would call trinities in a lot of cases, meaning 3 floors.
Into these outlying areas that were less desirable, places where the industries and the filth of the Industrial Revolution flowed.
It was a low-land, low-grade area, and around 22nd Lehigh, there was always water.
These very dangerous, low-paying jobs the Irish flocked to in huge numbers, beginning in the 1830s. And Philadelphia is one of the centers, one of the major focal points for that kind of work, along the rivers, along the Schuylkill River, Swampoodle, and along the Delaware River as well.
The Swampoodle's boundaries were from 17th and York to 27th and York, York to Indiana, 27th in Indiana to 17th in Indiana.
Swampoodle becomes attractive to Catholics in the 19th century.
What is something that was common to both Europe, where they came from, and the city of Philadelphia, where they were moving to?
Each community, at least initially, would have an ethnically affiliated church.
Because most of the immigrants brought their religion and brought their culture. Some of them were segregated by language. Some of them were segregated by socioeconomic class. And the church was always the epicenter, culturally, spiritually, for the neighborhood.
The Roman Catholic Church becomes absolutely essential to understanding Philadelphia's Irish community.
The Irish Catholic came and they built their churches first.
Just like in Ireland, it provides the sort of communal infrastructure. In Ireland, the church was often the only institution that the Irish could depend upon.
The Catholic presence in this area helped establish the unique nature of the neighborhood.
The services of the Roman Catholic Church back then were all in Latin. Therefore, no matter where you came from, it was something that would be familiar to you.
The congregation did a little response, but most of the response was by the altar boy to the priest in Latin.
There's no question about it. The Irish dominated the church. The church came to these neighborhoods like Swampoodle.
And when they come to the United States, first of all, so many Irish enter religious life as priests, brothers, and nuns.
The first bishop of Philadelphia was an Irishman, and there's been a very strong element of Irish presence in the Catholic hierarchy in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia from that time forward, from the earliest period of the 1800s through to the present.
They build an entire network around that factory, those houses, that church.
They built 5 churches in that region, and then they started to build their housing and the schools.
Perhaps the biggest symbol of that is Cardinal Dennis Doherty, whose nickname was God's bricklayer, who literally buys up land and builds much of that infrastructure and provides, again, the necessary sort of neighborhood support via Catholic Church as an institution.
We had many parishes in our neighborhood. We had St. Mary's, Corpus Christi, St. Columbus, and they were all within walking distance. So there was no excuse for not going to confession or not going to Mass, because there was a schedule that modified anybody's schedule.
The church was a very specific factor in the culture of the neighborhood.
The church was really the center of our lives in many ways, and especially in hard times.
When you think about church today, it was so regimented in our time. It's hard to believe that it's fallen away so far.
Our church was integral to our faith and to praying for the protection of our sons and our uncles and our fathers who were serving in the military. I remember in the Venus, making the Venus.
Sunday Mass was like the social event of the week. When you went to Mass on Sunday, my father was in a suit, my mother was in her Sunday dress, and we were in our Sunday best. And there was no other way to go to church. And that's how we went every Sunday, every holy day. And as a result, everybody else went the same way because nobody wanted to be embarrassed that they didn't have a suit or they didn't have a tie or they couldn't afford one. You went to Mass on Sunday, you went to Mass on a holy day, and you were expected to go to communion every Sunday and confession every Saturday.
It was a day that Mom would always make the big meal, the roast beef and potatoes and string beans.
On a Sunday morning, you could be walking through the neighborhoods and all you smell is the smell of gravy. It's actually, some people call it sauce, but we call it gravy. It's red gravy.
The dinners were major events of family gatherings. It was just a big celebration every Sunday growing up. I got to tell you, if you were part of that, well, as you got older, you really missed that because it was a beautiful time to feel and share love over dinner. And Sunday dinners in our house became special.
It was also important that you got a Catholic education and you taught your children how to be good, strong Catholics.
The parish at St. Columbus was a very important factor of our life.
In 1901, St. Columbus Parish was started.
St. Columba was an Irishman, born in Ireland.
He was a patron saint of Donegal, and the Irish that settled in there were mostly from Donegal.
And as a result, when they built the parish, it attracted Irish people all the Irish kids went to St. Columbus. To be Italian and get in the same areas, you had to have at least one parent who was Italian. So we had some Italians who'd rather go to St. Columbus.
I was in St. Columbus School, which was the largest Irish Catholic parish in the city at that time.
We were proud and honored to go to St. Columba.
The patriotism was, you learned that as much as you learned the catechism or learning how to read or write. It was one of the strongest things that you could learn.
I went to St. Columba. I went there from 1st grade to 8th grade.
We felt that that was the best school. We would compete with the other schools in Swampoodle through sports and other kinds of events.
While we were in 8th grade, they formed a CYO football team. We were so thrilled with that. A policeman by the name of Pete Hanlon was our coach. George Hanlon was one of the guys with us and played. And we had an unbelievable record. We were 11-1. We lost one game to St. Tim's. We became co-champions in 1961 with a CYO. Now, a lot of people in life can never say they were a champion, but we were.
In the post-World War II era, in a city like Philadelphia, which is a city of neighborhoods.
Growing up in Philadelphia, if you wanted to identify where you were from, you would specifically mention, often very out of the box, your parish. Secondarily, sometimes, the street or the corner where you were hanging out. No matter if you were from Philadelphia, those two identifiers were very good at telling people or your friends where you were from.
Growing up in Swampoodle was just an interesting life.
It was a wonderful, wonderful area to grow up in.
The neighborhood was tight. There were 60 homes on a block.
If we got in trouble, the whole neighborhood knew it. And you had to answer not only your parents, but the grandparents knew about it too, so.
My street that I lived on, Silver Street, well, I must have had 10 or 15 kids that lived on our street with me.
I had 6 brothers and sisters. I was the next to the youngest.
We felt safe.
I was the youngest of 5 children. And after I was a year or two old, my mother went to work at night so that she was home during the day when we come home from school, and my father was home at night when we come home from school.
I look back on living there, and I don't know how we did it with 7 kids in one bathroom. We had food on the table every day, and life was good.
It was just a good neighborhood. Everybody knew everybody from grade school. We knew everybody in school. We knew the kids that went to public school.
The group stayed together all the way through the 8th grade in the same classroom. No one would go out unless everybody went out.
You have the emergence of industrialism in Philadelphia, you know, the building of factories.
When we were growing up, there was factories all over the place and all. You could go from one factory to the next.
You saw every morning, whether you were going to school or it was a Saturday, lots of the men in the neighborhood going to work with their lunch pails.
There were 2 big rail lines that went through Swampoodle, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading Railroad. And the entire neighborhood was based on the movement of goods and creation of items for the Industrial Revolution. By the later 1800s, this is an area of prime significance, actually, in the regional economy.
The English who ran the city at the time, they needed laborers.
What the biggest thing about the hard-working groups that resided in Swampoodle was their work ethic. They went to work with coughs and colds. They couldn't afford to miss in those days. If you didn't work, you didn't get paid.
Swampoodle was one of those neighborhoods that was built and designed where you would have a factory and there would be housing within walking distance.
Back when I was young, If you wanted a job, all you had to do was walk down the street, walk into a factory and say, hey, are you hiring? And they would ask you to start that day.
There was a housing stock that was largely small row homes, which would have been affordable, and in proximity to those factories. So they basically could live and create their own small community.
There were big families in these little row homes, and providing for them, it was almost like everybody lived check to check. I didn't know that for a fact, but I know our family did with 6 of us, Dad and Mom. Dad worked hard, Mom ran the house. He would grab all the overtime he could get. And if there was overtime, he would get it. They had a lot of factories right there in the neighborhood where they could draw their labor pool. And you saw Midvale, there was Bud's, there was Tasty Cake,
Bayok cigars, Stetson hats,
John DuPont's gunpowder plants.
There was a bunch of little factories around there where guys, some of them, generations worked there. The grandfather, the father, and when the kid got out of high school, he had a job waiting for him. And my grandfather worked 44 years for Philadelphia Electric. He couldn't read or write English, but they used him for physical labor to unload telepoles at G and Luzerne, where they came in from Canada.
The rail lines that went through Swampoodle were kind of like the nerves of the neighborhood, the sinews of the neighborhood, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Reading Railroad. If there was a heart to the neighborhood, it might be Shibe Park, later known as Connie Mack Stadium.
One of my best memories of Swampoodle was Connie Mack Stadium. Shibe Park, as my dad called it.
Now, I lived at 25th and Lehigh. We could walk down to Connie Mack Stadium.
Had a keen interest in the Phillies because the stadium was a block and a half away, along with the Eagles. The Eagles played there for a couple of years.
There was a bar on every corner. When the Phillies were home, the neighborhood was alive. It was alive with numerous people from all over the city going to the ballpark. It was just an unbelievable time. You couldn't believe the activity there.
Philadelphia at one time had 2 Major League Baseball teams in it, and they both, for a very long period of time, for 5 decades, played together, different leagues, American League and National League, the Philadelphia A's and the Philadelphia Phillies at Shibe Park.
I went to school in that area, and I learned early on how to write an early dismissal slip, get out of school, and when the Phillies had a day game, I'd go across the street. For 50 cents, you could sit in the bleachers, and even day games then were packed with fans. And it was just an exciting atmosphere and a beautiful field. It was well taken care of. It was the cathedral of baseball, they called it at one time. And it was really nice to be able to get out of a boring history class and go watch the Phillies, even as bad as they were sometimes.
The A's left the city of Philadelphia in 1954, but leaving behind this legacy of the most winning sports franchise in Philadelphia history. They won 5 World Series. There's a lot of pride that the Philadelphia residents felt towards that team. A great shock when they left in '54.
When Shibe Park closes, its effects upon the neighborhood are numerous. First of all, it was part of the neighborhood culture. It provided the neighborhood with an identity.
And while the Philadelphia Phillies continued to play at Shibe Park in 1970, when the Phillies got a new stadium in South Philadelphia, there was a kind of heart of the neighborhood of Swampoodle pulled out. A lot of history, a lot of traditions, and a lot of jobs.
As kids growing up, we took full advantage of the people in coming into the neighborhood. We would save parking spots, and they would give us a quarter. Hopefully they would give us a quarter. God forbid if they didn't.
Everybody who sold lemonade at the ballpark, who was a bat boy at the ballpark.
We would send half the crowd would go to park cars, and the other half we would go to 19th Street and catch batting practice foul balls. 2 of us could get in if we returned the ball. So the guys who parked the cars would get money. We would team up about 10 of us. We went in and got in, and the guys with the money, we'd get a hot dog and a soda.
When it closes, it almost parallels the story of the neighborhood, because the park not only sort of stood for as a symbol of the neighborhood and gave it an identity, it also economically provided numerous jobs. Many of them would have been probably part-time jobs, a source of secondary income. But the importance of that is
the people from the neighborhood worked in the park. There's a lot of people working in a baseball stadium. People who tend the grass, people who sell food and novelties, people who watch the cars, and so on. Those jobs disappeared.
But once Tim McCarver scored the winning run in the bottom of the 10th, all hell broke loose. Fans stormed out of the grandstands and onto the field. Some fans began ripping up the wooden seats from the stands.
in economics, we have what we call the multiplier effect. That income generated by the park would have been taken by local residents and spent up and down Lehigh Avenue. And when the park closes, that has an economic effect upon all of Lehigh Avenue.
But then as jobs in the predominant industries in the neighborhood begin to get shipped overseas, especially in metalworking, iron factories and so on, there are thousands of people out of jobs in those neighborhoods.
As Lehigh Avenue begins to decline, you begin to have other effects as well. Crime goes up. Housing stock begins to go down. The neighborhood begins to change in ways that aren't positive ways. It begins to become a much more problematic neighborhood.
Eventually, of course, the stadium got torn down, kind of symbol of the destruction of the old heart of the neighborhood.
Philadelphia was known as the industrial center of this country.
Around the 1960s, I can remember where the neighborhood started changing.
Slowly but surely, the bigger companies, the smaller companies started to fail first, and then the larger companies. And because the larger companies started to fail, the ones that were supply chain factories, they started to fail. Now it was not so easy to get a job.
As you get multiple families having these experiences of layoffs, the neighborhood destabilizes.
People started to panic. They didn't do as well as they did. All of a sudden, it was an embarrassment back then if you were to go on welfare. Nobody would ever want to do that. And some of the families were devastated. They really lost what they had as their living.
The neighborhood began to change, I guess, when we were in 6th or 7th grade.
Things were changing in 65, 66.
Plants like Steelhead, On Bread, Bud Plant cut their shifts down. Instead of having 3 shifts, they were down to 1.
I had started a job at the bug company and got laid off, and I was sole support for my mother. There wasn't that many opportunities available.
We had the Botany 500 suit factory that closed down, and that was a blow to a lot of people that worked there. There were 400 or 500 people that worked in that factory.
Midvale Heppenstall had layoffs.
The people in the neighborhood, the values of the home were starting to decline. There was a drastic change.
We would call it the white flight, it seemed. Everybody was moving to the suburbs or up to northeast Philly or Roxborough or East Falls. It started breaking up the neighborhood.
Yet nothing in life really ever stays the same, but when you're happy in a place, you expect it to be the same.
The white flight really took off, I guess, 59 and 60. And that's when the neighborhood started breaking up.
As Swampoodle was changing, it wasn't exactly the safe place that we enjoyed, where we could walk everywhere and visit each other in our row houses.
The African American community started moving into the neighborhood and were not accepted.
And there started being more crime and more poverty because people would just leave their homes and all and move to other sections of the city.
I guess it was in 1959, 1960 time frame that Lehigh Avenue was the border I remember coming home from the pet fruit with my family from Friday night shopping. There was all these people and cops out in the intersection. I said, what's going on? And they said a black family moved in on Cambridge Street. Mom and pop shops were closing down too. There was more shoplifting, robberies, muggings.
I feel that at that time, I was about 15 or 16 years old, getting into trouble, getting into fights and everything else in my own neighborhood.
But it seems like the ones we went to school with, we knew all our lives. We didn't have a problem with them. It was the newer kids. People started moving out more and more in that summer of '63. That was the big change, '63, '64. People started moving out in the neighborhood. We were in high school in '64. The riots broke out down on Columbia Avenue.
The nature of the neighborhood started to change. It was also during the great migration of the blacks from the south into the north that came for those same factory jobs and started to lose their jobs also. And it caused a lot of contention between the races.
One of the great ironies about the racial tensions in Swampoodle is that in reality, blacks and whites were largely going through the same experience.
The white people, I think, felt that the black people stole their jobs. The black people thought that we come up here were misled. And in fact, it was an economic situation. The Japanese and the other countries that we had helped establish themselves after World War II and put so much money into bringing them back, took all our jobs. And an awful lot of people, I didn't think understood that at the time. And it did. It caused tensions among the people.
With the deindustrialization that hit the area, you had the same sort of family instability occurring in both black and white neighborhoods. As fathers lost jobs and families couldn't pay the bills, children didn't have the opportunities they had before when dad was working, that anger spilled out into the streets, both within the white community, within the black community, and then across racial lines.
I feel that the political people at the time, the political upper class, were using us against each other in order to enhance their own positions. And instead of trying to get us to come together, they were dividing us.
The transition from Catholic school to public school was a big problem for a lot of us because in Catholic school, there was a lot of discipline.
Just as Swampoodle faced interracial violence, much of that violence carried over to schools.
I was going to North Catholic. I was thrown out of North because my grades weren't that great and everything else. I had to go to Edison.
And in those public high schools, those same battles that were occurring in their neighborhood would be carried on in school.
There was a lot of problems in Edison between the whites and the blacks. Walking down the hallway, you get punched or whatever, you get into a fight.
There was fights in the lunchroom. There was gangs from different neighborhoods. There was racial gangs. There was police officers outside the high school. It was scary.
And not just simply white on black violence. Many of the black students came from neighborhoods that had gangs. So just as the Swampoodle white Catholics might hang together, there were various gangs in any given public high school in North Philadelphia.
There was an incident in the lunchroom where a friend of mine from the neighborhood was stabbed with a fork. And after that, I went home, and my mom said, "You're not going back there." And a lot of us didn't go back.
We also see a really interesting dynamic amongst some of the young men in the Swampoodle neighborhood. As fathers lose their jobs and the neighborhood deindustrializes and the family becomes less and less stable, many of these young men, the ones that are older, almost near an age where they can join the military, really begin to step up and become father figures in some cases, and protect the younger boys in the neighborhood. And by protect, I mean everything from actually physically protecting them from things like gang warfare and other forms of street violence, to also trying to teach them the ropes about making money.
After I was married and had the two boys, we moved to Roxborough. My neighbor right across the street was Pat Thurway, and his son went off to Vietnam.
Patrick Thurway was a really neat guy. He's a couple of years older than me, but he was a big guy and a powerful, strong guy, but he always looked after us younger guys. So if there was trouble or whatever, he was a guy that would come in and stick up for you. He would make sure that you were okay and that no bullies were beating you up.
They became real protectors, both in that literal physical sense, but also protectors in the way that a father might guide his son. That as fathers gave up those roles, these younger men stepped in to try and at least fulfill some of that. And then the other effect that comes from that is as these older young boys, for lack of a better term, as they begin to sign up for Vietnam, the younger boys, as they become of age, begin to emulate them. And you sort of see a succession of people in the neighborhood joining the service during the Vietnam War.
He was a guy that we all followed because he followed God first and country. And he joined the military and he did what he thought was best for him to serve the country. We were very proud of Patrick. Most of us from Swampoodle, we took his death pretty hard because of our relationship with him. He was a corner guy. We hung on the corner together.
I didn't know Pat in the old neighborhood, but he moved to Roxborough and I ended up living right across the street from him. And we became the best of friends because I lost my son in '72 and he had lost his son. So he knew I understood and I understood him.
They still wanted to impress their fathers. And their fathers had served, so they served. And then younger brothers see older brothers serving. They in turn joined the service and so on.
I was working night work at Oscar Mayer. My wife was home and the Army car pulled up. And they went into his house. And Jerry was at the front room window and she knew why they were going in there because she had two brothers who served in Vietnam.
And then there's the reinforcement that not only did you, for example, join if you were one of these older young men, but you saw your neighbors joining. You literally saw in the neighborhood sometimes as one neighbor was going, another was coming home.
They got out and they knocked on the door and they went in and they said, Mr. and Mrs. Thurway, and they told them what happened. And you could hear Mrs. Thurway all the way across the street screaming, crying. Mr. Thurway was more reserved. He cried, but he wasn't loud. But that night, Pat Thurway walked over to the house and he had young Pat's flag with him. And he sat in our living room and my neighbors were there. Pat came over and told us what happened. And he just sat there with the flag. And it was the saddest moment I'd had in a long time. And that's all he had was Pat's flag. I don't think they ever recovered Pat's body. So he ended up carrying that flag through life. He drank more because his heart was broken, and I think it helped him forget.
When we think about the concept of God and country, particularly individuals who come from a working class neighborhood, the church had informed these individuals as to their personal identity. That's also what the military does. God gives you a sense of purpose, but the military also gives you a sense of purpose. God gives you a sense of community, and the military gives you a sense of community.
I am so involved as a veterans activist was so excited to be part of that Vietnam era was because of the growing up in the Catholic, with a Catholic education.
Growing up in Swampoodle, believe it or not, really prepared us for the military.
Patriotism started in grade school, where, the beginning of every class, you would recite the Pledge of Allegiance.
I still can remember some of the nuns that instilled in us how important it was to be American, how important it was to stand when you saw a flag. That just didn't happen.
There was always the parade. They had the Veterans Day parade on 22nd Street. There was just a lot of things that would get you to think about the war.
4th of July, Memorial Day, Labor Day, the area was swamped with American flags, bicycles decorated. The pride of America just flourished in that neighborhood.
We hung on a corner and we learned loyalty to each other.
These nuns drove that into us and made us feel that this was an important part of our life, which it became and which it still is.
The nuns gave us a tremendous amount of discipline, and that really helped being in the military. You knew how to say, yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. And they were not to fight the system, and they were good things to know and to practice.
The Korean War, I was probably 8 or 9 years old when that was going on. I didn't understand it.
Being an Irish Catholic had the structure was to teach discipline and dedication and a heart's desire to be better.
But I remember reading the headlines of the Philadelphia Bulletin and the Inquirer about the war and about casualties and things of that nature, which concerned me, because we used to have the air raid in school.
And that's what the military teaches. It has the structure, discipline, and dedication to it. You learn to count on your brother next to you, and especially when you're in combat.
There was just other ways to get out of the neighborhood, and that was to go to school or to go into service.
The involvement of the Irish in the United States military is extensive and dates all the way back to the American Revolution. If you just think about a few figures from the American Revolution, John Barry plays a significant role in the formation of the United States Navy and combat during the American Revolution. Hercules Mulligan becomes really one of the first intelligence operatives in the history of the United States, gathering information about the British, feeding it to Alexander Hamilton, and playing a really important role in helping to develop battle plans and operations against the British. The real age of Irish involvement with the United States military is the Civil War. It's the age of really mass migration for the Irish. You've had the potato famine, actually multiple potato famines, and this has driven quite a lot of Irish to leave Ireland. Many arrive in the United States, and during the Civil War, as they come off the gangplanks, they are, in many cases, forcibly recruited into the United States military, where they serve with a great degree of gallantry.
In my search efforts to try and find the Roman Catholic High School alumni who gave their lives in World War I turned to my father because I had sort of hit a roadblock in trying to acquire the names. He suggested that I go to his old parish, St. Columba in Swampoodle. He remembered as a child a large war memorial plaque from World War I that was in the vestibule of St. Columba Church. I ended up visiting the church, and I came upon the large, it was a 4-foot by 6-foot bronze plaque, and it contained the names, it held the names of 486 parishioners who had served in World War I, and there was a special section of 27 names of those parishioners from St. Columba who had given their lives. When the United States got involved in World War II, that sense of patriotism that we found among the residents of Swampoodle in World War I also continued during World War II. It also extended during the Korean War and the Vietnam War as well. As a result of that, these students from Father Judge, Cardinal Doherty, North Catholic, and Thomas Edison experienced a high mortality rate, among the highest mortality rates during Vietnam as a result of the loss of life of their former students. Most of the former students from these schools who lost their lives in Vietnam enlisted.
Well, I had really had no idea that I was going to be either drafted or I just knew I was going to be in the service, and whatever happened, happened. You know, the war came to me, and that's really what happened. We grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was thinking about quitting school and joining the Marine Corps, but I wasn't old enough. I was like a year shy.
It was always in our mind that eventually we were going to go into the service.
You know, we were all in the same boat. We finished high school. We said, okay, we knew we were getting drafted.
Our fathers would tell us how important it was to serve.
And we got a better opportunity. Well, we had a better life than they did growing up. So we all felt good at the time to go into the service. I had no problem going into it.
And our family had a special bond to America because my uncle was killed on Normandy.
I had a sense of patriotism. My father, I'm named after him. My uncle Anthony, he got killed during the Second World War 2 weeks before his unit pulled out of Germany. And we have a tradition in my family to serve our country, coming from a proud Italian family.
It was scary times. You know, you had no control over anybody pushing the button to start a nuclear war.
And then when I had to make the decision, I said, okay, look, I'll join the Air Force and learn a trade.
Eventually, I did join the Marine Corps. I waited my time, graduated high school, and went on the Marine Corps.
You know, it's not easy to look back in July 15th, 1966.
Vietnam, it was a hard year to go through.
I got off a plane and immediately was in the Republic of Vietnam. I felt this humidity and heat in my face.
It was a hot and dry and the hot and wet. And the hot and wet, you were always wet. And the hot and dry, you were always thirsty.
I got processed through some orientation, as I recall. And then you had 2 weeks of what they call in-country training.
And then you had ants, red ants that would fall down and bite you, and they were hard. Then you had leeches. The leeches were on you all the time in the swamps and all. So you had to pick them off.
Running you up mountains, especially in An Khê, Vietnam with the 1st Cav, there was Hong Kong Mountain. They put 60 pounds of gear and ran you up every day to get you conditioned to the climate. But you knew deep down that this was all training.
One of my first times I was in a firefight around the Cambodian border, and we got hit by machine gun firing.
As I recall, my very first operation, we were with the ROK, the Republic of Korea troops, who were considered an elite fighting force over there. We followed the Iraq troops for a week. And at night, I would hear all this firing, machine gun firing, shooting, explosions, and I'd be somewhat scared, confused, whatever. And the next morning you would get up and you would see dead bodies along the stream bed where the Koreans engaged in a firefight. So now, looking back, I said, this is all by design. They want us to know what combat's like.
And I can remember being behind a tree, and I fired 2 clips of my M16.
The first firefight I was in, I'll be honest with you, I was frozen. I just didn't know what to do.
I had to reload my clips. Trying to put the bullet in the clip while you're being fired at, I'll say maybe 4 or 5 of them would drop out onto the ground. While I put 1 or 2 in, I would put the 2 in, load it, and shoot the 2, and then come and try to put the rest in. I was losing more bullets and being scared. You know, you're scared the first time when the bullets are flying around, and it's a scary moment.
There was bullets flying and hand grenades going off, and in all honesty, I didn't know what to do. I don't remember if I fired my weapon or not. I just froze because this was the reality. It was so surreal. I didn't know what to think.
It's hard to explain how you felt, and all years later, it's still hard to explain.
As you stayed in the field and you stayed in the bush and you started to get what I would call acclimated, for lack of a better term.
I would know the smell of the gunfire, and I could feel hearing the guys screaming and yelling. I just feel I get upset with thinking about it sometimes. I can't explain it like it should be explained.
And sure as anything, after a while, I would say after 6 months, I didn't have any comfort zone over there, but I had a feeling that I had to get home. What drove me was my father and mother had 5 other siblings at home. 5, 10, 16, 19, and 21. And I didn't want my parents to ever get that knock on the door.
On April 2nd, 1970, I was in a battle called the Battle of the Renegade Woods, where we lost 4 soldiers, killed and 12 wounded in my platoon. I was shot in the head, rescuing my platoon leader, who was shot in the stomach. I dragged him out of harm's way. I threw a hand grenade into an empty position and took out the machine gun that shot myself, my platoon leader, and many other people.
So after 6 months of training and being in firefights and scared and getting ambushed at night, you come to a conclusion that what's motivating you? It's certainly not the flag at this point. Unfortunately, it's not the flag, it's your brother next to you that you're walking the bush with, because you and him know that the war is not as popular as World War II or Korea, where the country was united. So now you want to get home, not to break your parents' heart and not to disappoint your brother next to you.
This is it. Live or die.
From 6 months to 9 months, you really start getting really a new keen sense of awareness. How do I survive? How do you get that keen sense of awareness? Well, you see guys dropping left and right. You see guys getting wounded. You see guys screaming for morphine. You see guys losing legs and treading on a booby trap. There's a host of factors. But at the end of the day, you wake up each day and you get more motivated. I got to get out of here. I got to make it. I got to do my job. I got to make it.
President Johnson, in March of '65, wanted 300,000 more men put into the military. I went in December of 65 when they're last to go. We all went into the service. Edmond and I ran into each other a few times, which the stories are legendary.
Once I was in Vietnam, back at base camp, and he came to visit me.
Choppers from the 1st Infantry were coming in. I asked my lieutenant, saying Edmond was up there, and he said, fine, Jim, go up and visit him. I go up, and I find him.
I didn't realize it was him. He shook me, and he woke me up, and I recognized him, but I thought he was a guy from our platoon. And I said, hey, how you doing, Jim? And I went back to sleep for a minute, and I got up. Oh, Jim, you know, what are you doing here? And we talked. We decided to go in town. Well, we went in town.
We get into town. We get into a bar. And there's one building across the street from the bar. It looked like a bank. We sit down at the table.
And we raised a little hell in town.
He has a beer. I have a beer. And we toast each other. And a machine gun burst goes across the table. He falls back. I fall back. And all hell broke loose in the town.
There was a sniper across the road from us where we were at. It's a long story. I tell that in my book, I don't want to say. But anyway, it was a little complicated.
You know, faith in Vietnam got magnified to a point where if you didn't have faith, I don't know how you could have made it.
The unique characteristic of a chaplain, as opposed to a parish pastor or a local clergyman, a chaplain is embedded with the troops. They live with the troops, they work with the troops, and they spend time with the troops. They are known by the troops.
Did I pray? Absolutely. Was I an altar boy over there? Yes. The chaplain asked me to help him use sea rations as a makeshift altar. And then with the sea rations, he would say Mass and give general absolution to 100, 200 guys and receive communion because he knew we were going into danger. Now, being a Catholic, raised a Catholic, an altar boy and all, my faith got magnified in Vietnam.
It's not uncomfortable for a service member to initiate a conversation with their chaplain because they know who their chaplain is and their chaplain knows who they are.
Because you prayed for the war to end. And novena after novena for the war to end and for your brothers to come home. And
when I came back from Vietnam, the country was deeply divided. It was a mess. There were anti-war protests, there were riots, and there were killings on college campuses. There was the Students for Democratic Society out of Berkeley and out of Columbia.
I understand them protesting against the war. I understand that. But don't protest about the Vietnam veterans that came back, that gave up a year of their life in Vietnam and put their life on the line for their country.
Apparently, a Vietnam vet got sobering reality check when he came back. And that was, did you do the right thing? Because your country certainly doesn't think you did.
When I got out of the service, nobody said, oh, welcome home, none of this. It was tough.
When I came home from Vietnam, I didn't get along with people, or people didn't get along with me for some reason. I don't know why.
It just seemed like you got discharged and they give you the travel ticket home, you go home, okay.
There are a number of things that Vietnam veterans brought home with them that were, let's say, in their minds for whatever reason. The anxiety, the nightmares, some would end up wife abuse. drug abuse, alcohol abuse, job changes that actually occurred to me many times.
I don't remember this, but when I first came home, my mother said that I would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. And I don't even remember it, but she said it was horrible. Right in the middle of the night, I'd wake up and scream and go back to bed. And I don't, I can't tell my mother wasn't telling the truth, but I don't remember doing that. My brother kind of validated it. He said, oh, yeah, you were a mess. From being in that environment and coming home, I just felt secure and safe. I didn't know how my behavior was.
Eventually, I had to leave my house. I was with my parents, and I remember one time I yelled. Everybody, they just backed away. They thought that I was going to go crazy or something like that.
Go look for a job. It was just military one day, civilian the next. Adjust. I just felt to myself that I couldn't trust anything. I just felt so bad that, you know what I mean? I don't know why. Rather it was through things that had happened in combat and things that happened in Nam. My personal life, losing the old girlfriend or anything like that, I had nobody.
I started drinking, and that became a problem for me. It seemed like I was drinking every day, trying to forget.
I got to a crossroads. Some kids in my neighborhood went with speed and heroin. They had a welcome home party for me.
We weren't expecting the welcome home that we thought we were going to get.
Everybody said, hey, Frankie, welcome home. Hey, Frank, welcome home. And unfortunately, I went in the kitchen, and guys I grew up with were shooting needles in their arm.
Some of my friends I tried to talk to and everything else, and they weren't, I don't know if they would, you'd call it sympathetic or whatever. They would say, oh, did you kill anybody? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, when am I going to brag, saying, yeah, maybe I did.
So I could remember vividly, I said, look, am I telling you not to put the needle in your arm? No. But you're insisting I do it. I don't like these rules. I walked out of my own party, got in the car and left.
How about kids? And I guess that got me depressed and everything else, and I just had to get away.
I couldn't sleep at night. Nightmares and disappointment were so prevalent.
I mean, my personal opinion was I just couldn't take it anymore, you know what I mean? Like, the whole world was caving in on me. I didn't know why.
I think of my parents off and on, regularly, every other day, things that I've learned from my mother and my father. They're both deceased. But Vietnam, I think about it every day.
One of the things that amazes me about Vietnam vets is when you speak to them about post-traumatic stress, it's amazing what triggers it. It could be triggered from a tree line. I've heard vets talk about that. It could be triggered from fireworks. I've heard Vietnam vets talk about that.
There's some kind of foliage or trees or areas that just trigger something. It could be on the parkway. It could be on a golf course. You're looking for the yardage. How far away is that? What can I do if I get ambushed? Here I am, 70 some years old, and I still think about the war. I still think about what I did or what I had to do. And it's disturbing.
When many veterans return from Vietnam,
somebody suggested that I go to the VA and get counseling help.
The Veterans Administration really failed to address many of the psychiatric issues that they face, specifically PTS.
When we went there, it wasn't too much of a friendly place. We weren't treated well. They didn't take people seriously.
Well, at that time, when I went there, they had no use for me. They gave me a number and a card, and they said, there's nothing wrong with you. You didn't lose any limbs. So I was just like hurt. Like, hey, I just came back from spending 4 years around the world, and you guys have no time for me.
There was nobody helping us. The VA wasn't there for us. They actually, people used to say they wanted you to give up and stop coming down.
And then we talked to a psychiatrist. He asked me so many crazy questions that it turned me off so bad I didn't go back to the VA for 20 years after that. They thought Vietnam veterans were just crazy.
So I decided at that point that I was just going to just suck it up and do whatever I had to do and go find a job and, you know, forget the war. Try to stick it out of your, take it out of your mind. And I did that for a long time. I didn't think about it.
The consequences on families was in many ways astounding. It led to violence in the family, it led to substance abuse, it led in many cases to increasing numbers of cases of divorce, veterans being separated from their children, losing those connections.
When I got married in 1973, I probably was a very high energy driven guy. Then I had 3 kids in 4.5 years. And I got transferred to Ohio. We bought a new house, and I was taking an executive MBA program out there. And the pressure, 50 hours a week, and the stress. My personality was extremely volatile. And unfortunately, my wife, who never ever was in the environment I was, couldn't understand why I could jump off the hook so readily or snap or just be angry. They were all my PTS symptoms being manifest through the stress of me taking on a bigger bite of the apple than I could chew. I had 3 kids. I'm going to school. I'm working 50 hours a week. I'm trying to get an MBA, and unfortunately, I pushed her away with my behavior. She was a good girl. She was a great mother. She didn't do drugs. She didn't sleep around. She was just great, but it was me not fully understanding the impact of PTSD, which I could tell you today harbors deep anger unless you can control it. PTSD, when you're traumatized, it manifests itself through anger, but you don't know that when you're living with it. So I went to the VA and I got help. And the VA was very good. I had counseling for a number of years. And the VA helped me deal with my own, it's called a mood disorder. PTSD with vets in Vietnam, a mood disorder. Your mood can change suddenly. So having known that then, I probably would have or should have sought help. But I didn't seek help till like 15 years after she left me.
When our veterans came home from Vietnam and they got in trouble that brought them into courts, people weren't very receptive to trying to help these veterans. Today, tide has turned. When our veterans come home from long wars, they have trauma, come home, they get in trouble with the law. We have this program called Veterans Court, where we do a holistic type of approach to try to help our best citizens. And these are our veterans who are willing to put their name on a blank check to our nation. Our jails were full of Vietnam veterans who did not get that type of service when they came home from their trauma.
This is universal. What happened as far as post-traumatic stress being experienced by Vietnam vets and by World War II vets was probably the same thing. It's just, how do you deal with it? And people dealt with it in different ways. We're not stronger from one generation to another. It's just the impact of society. And society gave us a different perspective. And today we know about post-traumatic stress. We know about traumatic brain injury and its effects and how to deal with it. We know about the effect that it has on people that would drive them to suicide. And that is what we want to prevent. Whether you're a World War II vet, a Vietnam vet, or a Gulf area vet, they have experienced the same trauma, and we need to deal with that trauma.
Billy Garvin was a kid from the neighborhood, smartest guy in our class, but he was a man's man. He played ball with us. He did everything with us. Time the war from school, we knew we were all going to be drafted. Billy graduated and joined the Air Force. His time in Vietnam was he was a forward observer, B-52 bombing raids. We never saw Billy Garvin in Vietnam. When we came home from Vietnam, one time he settled in Florida and came up to see us. We heard he was having a lot of difficulty. He settled into Florida, got really involved in the war effort, and got really involved in drugs. Got so involved with the war protesting that one of the huge demonstrations was in New York, and Billy Garvin was the guy on the top of the Statue of Liberty flying the American flag. He did get in pretty serious trouble with that. He did not serve any time in jail, but he was totally against the war, and he never recovered from it. Edmond and I heard this, and we went down to see him in Florida. We tried to talk to him until we were blue in the face, that Bill, you have more opportunity than a lot of us have. Your intelligence. There was no talking to him. We left him. We stayed there for 3 days with him. We left him. Our hearts were broke. They did bring him back to Philly to be buried, and we all went. And then we had a big service for him at St. Columba, and at that time the neighborhood was changed. We had a wonderful luncheon for him, but the priests in the neighborhood made it an Irish mass for Billy Garvin, and they sang Danny Boy, and the choir was a black choir. There wasn't a dry eye in the place.
Actually, the VFW, you couldn't become a member there because they didn't consider Vietnam a war. And a lot of veterans still to this day have a bad taste about the VFW because of that reason.
Things were rapidly changing. To say you were a Vietnam veteran had dishonor to it.
And we got back from Vietnam, and we all got out. A bunch of Vietnam vets, we got together, and we decided to go down and join the VFW. Went to a local VFW, and they wouldn't let us in. The reason they gave, they turned around and said, you guys, you're all junkies. You do drugs, you're baby killers, and we don't want you. So they wouldn't let us even join. So after that, most of us kept quiet about being in Vietnam. We didn't even talk about Vietnam for like 30, 40 years later. Even my brother Ed and I. You know, he was in Vietnam prior to me. I had cousins that were in Vietnam. I had a lot of friends from the neighborhood who were all in Vietnam. None of us talked about it. Just avoided it at all costs. And we went about our lives, and we just did what we had to do until years later when finally we started discussing it.
Most of us went to Vietnam. Thank God, most of us returned from Vietnam, and a lot of us have had issues from Vietnam.
We sacrificed our lives, our limbs, to come home and to be treated like that.
It was only amongst your peers that you were with who you could find solace with and some peace, who understood Vietnam.
One of his friends needed a lot of help. And my husband locked him in the car until you go. He said, I'm not letting you out until you go to the VA and get help.
Each person handled that issue in a different manner, but most of us made the best of our situation and made the best life that we could for all of us, and we all shared our common bond together with knowing we all were in the war together.
When we were there, we were 18 years old when we went. We came home and we were 21, 22 years old, experiencing everything that we all did together before we were on the corner and after we were on the corner.
To navigate coming back from Vietnam, you had a lot of decisions to make. Did you want to do hard drugs? I mean, toting on a marijuana cigarette wasn't a major crime to me, but shooting in your arm was not for me. And taking pills and snorting shit, there was something deep in my heart where that was out of bounds for me.
And you would pick up those pieces and you would get back in the fight, because the things that you learned in Swampoodle as a young kid was that you never give up and you fight.
Somehow I think my upbringing, my education, my Catholic education, my environment in Swampoodle, I walked the straight and narrow and landed fine.
And I had to find in my own life ways to fight within myself and the system that was laying before me. So I buried myself in getting an education and buried myself in a job. And that's what you did.
There was such a strong avenue for everyone of us to talk to each other and gave each of us strength to carry on to the horror that we went through.
I have friends, I have my brother that have served and in combat, and you know, we share stories, funny stories, things that happen, and that kind of helps you heal.
We could handle each other's emotion and affection that we didn't get from anyone else.
It makes you cry. They need help. The Swampoodle friends reach out to each other, and they love the camaraderie and friendship they enjoy, and they love telling the stories growing up and then sharing the experiences that they had in Vietnam. It's just wonderful. It's a wonderful, phenomenal experience for all of them.
Jim, when he came home from Vietnam, I was waiting for him.
They have a house in Margate, and I come home in July of '67, and where do I go? I go right to Margate with them.
I knew he was coming home the day I called his mom.
It was just like we never left. We party, Maloney's 7 beers for $1. Thank God that Billy Gardner was with us, because he knew the 7-time table. We knew how many beers we were going to get. I meet my wife. I fell in love, and I break off of the ground, get married.
When he got married, I was in his wedding. When I got married, he was my best man at my wedding.
I end up coming on the Philadelphia Police Department. Edmond meets a lovely girl, Elaine, down there. He falls in love.
Edmond and I met in Margate, New Jersey, on the day that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. We were watching it.
I met her at the Gables one time, and I knew, wow.
And Edmond comes sliding over with the big blue eyes and the big smile and said, "Where you been all my life?" And it was like a lot at first sight.
She was smart, and I wasn't really smart, like I would say, but I was okay.
When he came home from the shore in November, our first date was his best boyfriend's wedding, Jimmy Fogarty.
We got together. She stuck with me more than anybody else, I thought.
We started dating for 2 years, and we got married July 10th, 1971. And his best friend wanted him to get married in the worst way.
Not only love was involved, but she was Catholic, she was a school teacher, she was educated, and I knew that for me to get through things, she was more sympathetic towards me, and we started raising a family, and I love my family.
I'm in the police department, and Edmond's working for Frito-Lay, and I happen to be assigned to the 15th district, and that's the district that Edmond lived in. And I was fortunate enough when I'd be on port or trial to be able to stop at his house and see him. Because when you're in the police department and we're having kids, we kind of did get separated from each other for a few years. We would go out occasionally.
His kids call me uncle. My kids call him Uncle Jim. So we've been there all our lives together.
He was the best thing that happened to me. He often says I was the best thing that happened to him.
And when my brother Edmond had a situation where he had to be hospitalized, and I went over there and talked to him, it was very emotional, very psychological, and we had to sit down and talk.
At nighttime, I'd open my eyes in bed, and his eyes would be wide open. I went, uh-oh, there's something going on. And I knew right away to put him in. So I put him in the hospital, and they sent him home with medicine. But at the time, some of his family members were very upset that I would do that. To me, we're going to get him help.
It was a very trying time for all of us, for the family, for all of us. We had to sit down, we had to work that out. We had to get somebody to come in and explain to us that we had PTSD. We had no clue what it was at that time. I sat there by Eddie. I can remember looking into his eyes and saw how upset he was. And it was really upsetting to me that I couldn't do anything for him.
So we're all sitting out on the step, all the neighborhood kids and my 3 children. And he's sitting on the step, like looking at a distance far away. And then his daughter, who was 5 years old, sat on his lap. And at the time, he was thinking about committing suicide. I did not know that because he kept it to himself. But when his daughter, who was 5, and then he had a son 8 and another daughter 3, and when his 5-year-old daughter sat on his lap and gave him a big hug, it snapped him out of it. And I heard you need something like that to snap you out of your depression.
Finally, we were able to work it out, thank God, and now we know where we stand.
Well, now we're always together. We're down here. We go out to dinner. We meet on Thursdays. We call it Thirsty Thursdays at one of the clubs in Wildwood.
My wife means everything to me. She was my rock and all. A little girl, the way she was, she stuck with me through hard times. If I lost my job or if I got upset or anything like that, she was very loving and caring.
All his life, he was a hard worker. Never missed one day's work. When I'm raising 3 babies, you need that income coming in.
His wife and my wife, they go out to dinner, keep in constant contact with each other.
He was a great husband, a great father. I can't say enough about him.
I thought to myself, I got myself the best girl in the world. She treated me like gold. Never questioned any problems that I had or anything like that. She always tried to solve them for me.
At our late age, where we are, we're fortunate enough to have each other still. I think the world of Edmond. He's been a true dear friend. In any situation I have been in, he's been right there.
We enjoy one another. We've been together. We've been in fights together. We did everything. We did as much as we could.
My brother was killed years ago, and he was right there for me. His brother got killed, and I happened to be the policeman who was on the scene for that, and I was there for him. And the friendship has ever faded in that time where our hearts were both broken for our brothers. It made our friendship stronger because it gave us even a closer bond. He's always been my brother that I lost, and I've always been his brother that he lost.
When I came home from Vietnam, the neighborhood wasn't there anymore. All my buddies and friends, there was nobody left. There was nobody around. They were all scattered into other neighborhoods.
A lot of them went to Roxborough. A lot of them went to Bucks County. But South Jersey was a big place for people to go.
And it was a chore trying to find everybody. And for many, many years, it really lay dormant. But somehow there was a reunion, and that started the process of Swampoodle being reunited.
In 1987, in Roxborough, me and a couple guys threw a reunion. Now, understand, most of us left Swampoodle in the mid to late 60s.
And it was great to see the guys again. It was interesting to learn what caused us to join the military. And there was this belief, this structure that we had, that the country was good, that the country was doing good, and it needed us.
So in '87, we had a reunion in Roxborough, and it was an overwhelming success. And all the guys you grew up with went to grade school, high school, you know they were in the NOM. You kind of lost contact because they were busy raising families now. They were in their 40s and kids in college, and we had a great reunion. It was so nice.
That's how we were taught in Swampoodle, to do the right thing. And that's what we all formulated. And to get back together again and to meet each other again was really a very special process.
Around 2000, 2003, there seemed to be some unexplained migration to the Jersey Shore. 20 guys showed up from our neighborhood, from Ocean City down to Wildwood, who all retired or bought summer homes as they hit their 50s and 60s. The kids were raised, they bought a summer home down here.
Cut off the cadence loud and strong, for wherever we go, you always...
So we had a reunion in Keenan's in 2007 or 8, I want to say. Another reunion. Everybody in the neighborhood came. It was an incredible amount of guys you grew up with around your neighborhood that are all living at the shore, retired now.
And then we moved down here in 12, and we absolutely love it. And then they just had a big Swampoodle reunion.
The brotherhood and the bonding that they have coming from neighborhoods like Swampoodle is amazing, and there's no doubt that they survived the trauma after they came home. Dealing with whatever occurred to them while they're in Vietnam is because of the bantering and the brotherhood and a few beers that have gotten them through it.
We knew that the shore was always a subconscious dream of all of us, because when we were younger, your family took you to the Jersey Shore for a week or two at a time, and it was a great time. But it was only a place to visit, not to live or stay.
The love that these guys for each other is beautiful. And the stories that they tell about growing up in Swampoodle, it was a beautiful place to live.
And now we're all down here, and it's an incredible thing. So I kind of give that to Swampoodle's favorite destination for vacation was the Jersey Shore. And all my generation wound up down here. Fast forward, we just had a reunion recently at the American Legion. We had 120 people show up. I had seen guys I hadn't seen since 1964 at that reunion. But they're down the shore now.
They also talk about their experiences they had in Vietnam. They have this camaraderie of the neighborhood that they loved so much growing up.
Well, what is that? I don't know if you can define it or describe it as deep-rooted friendship. Is it environmental neighborhood factors? But the critical factor was we all seem to wind up in the same place in our golden years. It's incredible.
We'll probably never really know where the name Swampoodle came from. There's no real historical record of why the neighborhood was called Swampoodle. There is an urban myth that the neighborhood's German residents were unable to pronounce the word Swampoodle, which may be true, but is likely not true. The reality is that what we do know is that there was a creek that ran through the neighborhood near 21st and Lehigh. That may have been prone to flooding at certain times, for example, after heavy rains. What we do know that is important, that Swampoodle emerged as a neighborhood because it sits in proximity to the convergence of 3 rail lines. those rail lines would have been highly valuable to the surrounding factories to be able to move goods and resources in and out of the neighborhood. And that really becomes the defining reason for the emergence of the neighborhood of Swampoodle more than anything else.
Simultaneous with the change in the American industrial infrastructure is the beginning of one of the most important wars of the Cold War, the Vietnam War. When you have individuals who have to go, maybe in some cases out of economic necessity, into service, military service, people whose parents are put out of jobs in factories, there's going to be some huge social consequence to these huge factors that is probably beyond the ken of the knowledge of the average person. These huge tidal waves of change sweeping through a neighborhood, and the result, unfortunately, is urban blight. As the factories closed, as people were put out of work, and very few options in the future for those individuals compared to their parents and their grandparents' generation who could have had decent jobs in industry and decent jobs even working at Scheid Park, Connie Mack Stadium.
I grew up in North Philadelphia, an area we called Swampoodle, which was basically Italian and Irish. We grew up together, we went to school together, we hung around together, we played ball together, we went down cheer for the Phillies together. Some of us moved out of the neighborhood during the high school times, but we still hung around together. When the Vietnam War broke out, some of the members went in the Marines, some went in the Navy, some in the Air Force. A lot of us went in the Army because we knew we were going in the Army. We went in because we knew it was a patriotic thing to do. We felt it was a patriotic thing to do. It was a neighborhood thing to do because we all stuck together.
And what's occurring now is that later in life, as one approaches retirement or is retired, you have this free time and your energies seem to go back to what occurred in the war. And I think what has really been best is the system that we have. We have camaraderie-ship at VFWs and American Legions, and for me, the Military Order of Purple Heart. And we've learned more about our own faith in walking life and in all its trials and adversities. We learned how to increase our faith in God. And because of His grace and mercy, I believe that we've become citizens and are better able to endure what retirement has. And retirement has time to think about and to reflect on all of the things that have occurred in life. Not only does it have you looking at some of your mistakes and regrets, but it also has a time to review your victories and your non-successes that taught you who you are today. And those things are vitally important.